Hi, and thanks for tuning in to Take It or Leave It Movie Commentaries. Today we're going to be looking at the 1971 James Bond film Diamonds Are Forever, starring Sean Connery, Jill St. John, and for some reason, Charles Gray. The film was directed by Guy Hamilton. I'm a huge James Bond fan, but as will become clear as we go through the commentary, I am not a big fan of Diamonds Are Forever. I think it's a very silly movie, basically bordering on slapstick at times. I think it was sloppily written, sloppily directed, and edited in a way that makes almost no sense at all. But my feelings on it will become clear as we go through the commentary. So thanks for joining us, and let's get into it. And here we go. If you'd like to follow along, I'm not sure if anyone does that, but if you'd like to follow along with the commentary, I'm watching Diamonds Are Forever. This is my Amazon copy on Amazon Prime, so I have DVDs of this. I've probably got more than one, but if you'd like to follow along exactly, you can start your Amazon copy right now. Diamonds Are Forever, like I said, is 1971. It was, of course, the follow up to On Her Majesty's Secret Service, which did not perform as well as most of the other Bond films, but it did do well. Just not as well as the producers would have liked. But Lazenby was going to continue in the role, but from because of some terrible advice from his managers and agent, and also just partly based on his own arrogance and bad decisions, which Lazenby now admits, he turned it down. His people and Lazenby himself kind of thought that Bond was a fading entity and that other kind of grittier movies were on the rise, and that the series, as far as 007 goes, could not survive without Connery. And you can't really blame him for that thought. I mean, this is before it was accepted that a new actor would take over the role. Every 4 or 5 films, sometimes more, sometimes less. But it was a reasonable guess that the series could not go on without Sean Connery. And here we get our first look at Connery, with the audio kind of sped up there for some reason. If you see the trailer, you can see that Connery's voice sounds more normal. I'm not sure why they decided to speed up the "My name is Bond," but they didn't ask me. And and here's our first look too at Charles Gray as Blofeld, even though he apparently is not Blofeld here. Although it can get a little confusing about when he is Blofeld and when he's not. Gray was a terrible choice, in my opinion, for this role. He is far too mannered and British. He basically uh, he seems like a polite butler to me. Not sinister, not evil. Certainly not someone that would have been capable of outsmarting Bond or participating in the murder of Bond's wife. But in this mud bath sequence, this is one of the few parts of Diamonds Are Forever that actually does relate to the Ian Fleming novel. I've read Diamonds Are Forever and kind of reviewed it again recently. It's not one of the better Bond books, so I can see, excuse me, why they chose to kind of come up with their own idea. Although this idea that they have here is fairly tame compared to what they originally were hoping to do with Diamonds Are Forever. But there is some things about mud baths and stuff like that in the novel Diamonds Are Forever. So they did include that. I'll go into the original plans for this film in a minute. and you can see Connery. He's definitely put on some weight since we last saw him in You Only Live Twice. Although he doesn't seem quite as bored to me as he does in You Only Live Twice. He at least is energetic about the role here. If you haven't seen You Only Live Twice in a while, if you rewatch it, and especially knowing how Connery felt about the role at that point, you can see that he is very bored, and his performance borders on just flat out apathy and sometimes annoyance. He had been very frustrated with the with the Japanese press, and was really ready to walk away from the role. This fight sequence is very I don't know, dull, not very exciting. I do like that line though, "Welcome to Hell, Blofeld," and then when he sees the cat here, although it's not very clear there if he's seeking revenge for Tracy or not. They try to leave On Her Majesty's Secret Service within the kind of the canon here, but without referencing it directly, which of course is because of Lazenby's involvement, which is a shame. I think On Her Majesty's Secret Service is one of the best Bond films, and I really like Lazenby in the role. It's not a perfect film by any stretch, but I definitely prefer it to to Bond films like this one. Roger Moore typically gets the credit or the blame, depending on how you look at it, for turning the Bond films into just about flat out comedies. And there's no doubt that most of his films um, are in that vein, but really it starts here. Diamonds Are Forever, in my opinion, is basically a Roger Moore film with Sean Connery in the role, and there's some things in this movie that are much sillier than anything you'll see in one of the Roger Moore films. We'll get into that a little bit later, but as far as what they originally intended to do with Diamonds Are Forever, I kind of get the feeling that the producers thought as well that the series may be on its last legs, and that even though Connery had originally been contracted for two more films, he obviously only did this one, and he was paid over just over $1 million, by the way, and he donated that to charity, or at least most of it. But but they they kind of wanted to go out, it seems to me, with one big bang, and they reverted to the Bond film that that at the time, and even now, was kind of seen as the prototypical very successful Bond film, which was Goldfinger. They were going to bring Gert Frobe. I think his last name is actually pronounced Froba, but they're going to bring Gert Frobe back as Goldfinger's brother or twin brother, and have him be the head of Spectre, or the head of his own organization. And instead of being obsessed with gold, he was going to be obsessed with diamonds. And I just get the feeling that they wanted to kind of mesh the elements of the most successful Bond film at that point, together into one last big showy Bond. That idea was scrapped, obviously, but they kept a lot of the elements of that original idea in place. It would have been interesting if they did get Gert Frobe back, because he was dubbed in Goldfinger. I'm not sure why his dialogue, as originally shot, you can actually see that in the original Goldfinger trailers, and he seems fine. But if they had cast him in Diamonds Are Forever, it would have been interesting to see if they would have kept Gert Frobe's own voice, or if they would have gone back and gotten the same the same actor to dub his dialogue. Even this scene here, um, with with Bond and M is very similar to the scene in Goldfinger where Bond and M meet and first discuss Goldfinger's smuggling operation and where Bond gets the gold bar. And this sequence is kind of confusing. I doubt anyone watching this the first time really understands kind of what's going on. I think it's a good idea for expedience sake to kind of show the diamond smuggling operation as this guy is explaining it. It's definitely more interesting than just seeing him sitting there talking. But because of the way it's shot, it's not exactly clear what's going on. I mean, I understand it now, but the first time you watch, um, it I don't think anyone would necessarily pick up on the dentist and the guy going into the dentist and then smiling with that big grin and like what exactly does that mean um, and all that. But that's far from the biggest issue with this film. As I mentioned in the intro, this is definitely not one of my favorite Bond films. I don't mind some comedy being included in the films, but when we get to the point where we're almost in slapstick territory, which is what goes on here. That to me just does not fit in a Bond film. And here we meet Wint and Kidd. They're also two elements, although their characters are handled very differently in the film. But they're from the novel as well, and they're actually I think a pretty good addition to the film as far as how they're handled. They definitely keep things interesting. Kidd is played by Potter Smith, who was a musician, actually, not an actor. Yeah, I'm not really sure how or why they chose him for this. And excuse me, the other actor is Bruce Glover, who plays Mr. Wint. Um, I think he does a really good job with his role. This scene was changed. I'm not sure if it was actually shot. It was as it was originally written, or and they just chose this version. But originally, Mr. Wint shoved the scorpion into the doctor's mouth. That was obviously considered a little too much, so they had him slip it into his shirt, which I actually think works better. I don't it you know not sure it makes much sense to force a scorpion into somebody's mouth, but um, it it's a risky move. I mean, not now, obviously, but back in 1971 to show Wint and Kidd walking off holding hands, including two gay men in a James Bond film, was certainly um, not something that had been done before. Um, and it does add something a little bit to their characters here. It doesn't bother me either way as far as the story goes. I think it probably does make them a little more interesting, and at least uh, makes them different than just a regular pair of assassins. Although it has nothing to do with the story or really much to do with their behavior, except for a couple of snide looks here and there. if you were overusing your cologne like that he's spraying, you would reach the high heaven. I mean, people would smell that guy coming from a mile away. Now, this sequence, as far as what they're doing with the diamonds and the chain, the smuggling is more clear at that point. I think it's a little less clear with the whole guys in the mine and then the dentist part and all that. Maybe that's just me, but I just never thought it was very clear what was happening. And you can see there Connery, does seem to be enjoying himself a little more. He's definitely comfortable in the role, and he's got a better hairpiece actually in this one than in some of the films as well. And this, I think, could have done this scene introducing Peter Franks. I think it might have been, I don't know, a little more effective if they'd actually shown um, at least just a second or two of Peter Franks kind of being taken into custody, maybe through the window or something. Um, because to me, I don't know that it's exactly clear that Peter Franks has been taken out of the picture supposedly until later on when they mention that he's escaped. Um, this is Lois Maxwell's only scene in this film. She only has a couple of lines of dialogue, but I think that works pretty well. By this point, they pretty much exhausted what they could realistically do with the character and her kind of back and forth with Bond. So I think the fact that she only appears there very briefly, I think that's actually a good thing. The Bond theme showing the hovercraft is a little unnecessary there. And this scene here with them lifting Mrs. Whistler out of the water is pretty graphic, and it's a well done scene because it's just pretty brutal, and you get the idea that the people behind the diamond smuggling are certainly not playing around to kill this elderly woman, even though she's obviously a criminal herself. And it's actually a little out of place in this film, although they quickly kind of revert back to a little bit of comedy here with Mr. Kidd taking a picture of them pulling her body out of the water. I don't know if that's something he does on a regular basis, is take photographs of his victims, but that's a whole another level of psychopathy. I mean, that's kind of Ted Bundy territory, or Jeffrey Dahmer. And we're about to get our first look at Jill St. John. I I think Jill St. John at first does really well in this film. She's got a lot of chemistry with Sean Connery, which, from all reports, was something that was genuine and continued when they weren't on screen together. The same thing goes for Lana Wood, and there's a few stories of Lana Wood and Jill St. John having a fairly serious rivalry because Connery had been involved with both of them during the making of this film. But Jill St. John's obviously very attractive, and she's presented at first as a very resourceful, smart, uh, tough diamond smuggler. Unfortunately, later her character deteriorates into basically a dingbat who doesn't seem to be able to put one foot in front of the other. I'm not sure where they got. the idea that she should turn into to nothing more than a damsel in distress, but it kind of ruins the character later on. This little bit with the fingerprints is a good touch. And you'll notice something here later, actually, when Bond calls Q and compliments him on the fingerprint switch, that they're loading missiles into Bond's Aston Martin in the background. You have to look closely to catch it, but it's a pretty interesting little sight gag. And Connery's great there with his his little sexual overtones with his dialogue. He was always good at that because for one thing, I think it was probably pretty genuine for who Connery was in real life and how he went through life. And by the way, I'm not criticizing Connery at all. I think Sean Connery lived a very interesting life and was a very interesting person. He did things his way and became a superstar. It's hard to find fault with that. And it is funny that she comes out finally in her genuine red hair. I'm not sure what she was doing with those wigs anyway. In the book, by the way, she's blonde. Jill St. John, by the way, we'll meet Lana Wood later in the role of Plenty O'Toole. But Jill St. John was a longtime friend of Robert Wagner, who was married to Lana Wood's sister, Natalie Wood. And they were married when Natalie Wood, of course, drowned. The circumstances of that have never really been clear. There's the missiles going into the Aston Martin in the background, and and that's always been one of those Hollywood mysteries that there'll never really be a solution to. Apparently, Robert Wagner, his wife Natalie Wood, and Christopher Walken were. Christopher Walken, of course, is a villain, is the main villain in A View to a Kill, Roger Moore's last Bond film. But they were on a yacht together one night doing whatever it was they were doing, and Natalie Wood, for some reason, apparently decided to take the I don't know, lifeboat is probably not correct, but like a dinghy, and she ended up falling into the water and drowning. No one's ever been charged with a crime in relation to the whole thing, but it was a pretty tragic event. This is actually a really good sequence here in a film filled with not very interesting fights. This is a brutal battle here between Bond and the real Peter Franks, given the small confines of the lift here and the glass shards and the punches. They do a great job too with the sound effects with the punches. They're not overdone here, and they sound like they might really be hitting each other. And there's no music. They just let the sounds of the fight carry us through here, which I think is a good choice. Till right here. And really, I think they could have done without the music here. There's no real reason to ramp up the drama. I mean, we can see what's happening with the fact that Bond's face is about to get rammed into the wall here, but or into the ceiling. And even there, you can see there's a change in Jill St. John's character already. She's wide-eyed and cowering in the doorway as if she's afraid of what she's seeing. It's hard to believe a diamond smuggler on the level of what Tiffany Case's character is supposed to be, as far as that line of work, would be that bothered by by a fight. But that's actually Connery doing most of the stunts here in this fight, including when they get off the elevator with some punches and kicks, and um, I mean that was unusual. But that fight is definitely something more out of From Russia with Love or On Her Majesty's Secret Service. But here we revert right back to something that doesn't make any sense when she pulls out his Peter Franks' wallet, which of course is Bond's wallet because he switched it, and I think it's a little too cute that he has a key for the Playboy Club, but you just killed James Bond, and this is kind of a joke to the audience, which okay, fine, but obviously it makes no sense for a secret agent to be that well known, especially just to a bunch of smugglers. If he's that famous, he's not going to be much of a secret agent. And if he is that famous, why doesn't she know what he looks like? Um, it's kind of throwing credibility out the window for a quick gag. And I'm never a fan of that, whether it's in a Bond film or a television show or anything else. And by the way, I know I'm being very critical of this film. Like I said, this is far from one of my favorite Bond films. Um, but I like all Bond films, and I like this movie. My criticism is in the realm of Bond films. I like everything James Bond. I like the Pierce Brosnan films, most of which I think are very weak, but I'm a big enough Bond film where I like them all. Um, this just happens to be one of my least favorites, if you haven't been able to figure that out yet. And here's one of the times where the fact that the characters are gay kind of comes into play because he doesn't like the fact that he finds Tiffany Case attractive. But it could have been just as effective and probably more sinister if you had just seen the fact that he was watching her through the curtain. I don't know. They didn't really need that little ha ha moment. But the movie is full of those. It kind of never knows when to stop. And here comes this is an actor. Gosh, what's his name? I think his name is Norman Burton. He's an old television actor that popped up in all kinds of things back in the day. He he may be the weakest Felix Leiter in the entire franchise. If he's not the weakest, he's definitely one of them. He's not an impressive looking Felix Leiter for one thing. Doesn't have a lot of screen presence, but most of the problem is script based. He becomes a little more than a bumbling policeman. Um, Certainly doesn't look like anyone who could be doing a similar job to what James Bond is expected to do. He basically is just treated as a bureaucrat you might run into at the Department of Motor Vehicles. And the head kind of mob guy here that's driving the car pops up later, and the man with the golden gun, his name is Mark Lawrence, and he's an actor that's been around for, or I mean he's dead now, of course, but he'd been around for years, usually playing villains, and there's kind of a not really a debate, but a question of whether he's the same character that shows up at Scaramanga's Island in The Man with the Golden Gun. I think it's a it's a nice idea that he might be, but I doubt that's what was intended. Continuity with these films back in the '60s and '70s was not a priority, and doesn't seem to be something that producers gave much thought to. But it's a nice theory. I do like these scenes at the slumber mortuary. There, Connery does a good job, and the and him in the sequence that's coming up when they actually put him in the casket is a genuinely frightening circumstance for anyone to be in. Although it's kind of a letdown, in my opinion, that he just gets saved by Shady Tree and does not figure out a way to escape on his own. I don't really know what that would be, but I think that's lazy writing just to have someone else suddenly pop open the casket. You can kind of compare that to the scene in Goldfinger, which is similar when Bond is strapped to the table and has to talk his way out of the laser. I mean, that is really excellent writing, and it's a very tense scene. It's one of the best scenes in any Bond film. But it's an example of why of why the film Goldfinger works so well. I mean, it's just it's top notch writing, and just like that's why that film works so well. You see, a very similar scene here, and why this film doesn't work so well. The writing was rushed, and in many ways is very lazy. And as I mentioned before, they often don't seem to know when to stop with the scene or a or a comedy sequence. Tom Mankiewicz was the writer, by the way, but I think it's a lot of these Bond films in these days, the writer was basically just used to put different sequences that their producers thought of together in some sort of form that made sense. So I'm not sure how much freedom Mankiewicz had in setting the tone of any of the films he wrote. And obviously, the casket scene is totally unnecessary. I mean, they could have walked up behind Bond right there at the grave and blown his brains out from behind, and he never would have known what hit him. But if you're looking for that sort of logic, not to pick up a Bond film in the first place. And there's Shady Tree. I'm not a big fan of his character here. There's a lot of these types of shots and kind of mini story ideas in the Connery Bond films of James Bond's death. They have the whole very unnecessary plot in You Only Live Twice, which involves pretending that Bond really has been killed and performing his funeral at sea. Here they have, of course, Bond in a casket. He's even posed in the casket as if he's deceased. They have in Thunderball in the pre-credit sequence where the casket has his initials on it. There's a lot of that, and from Russia with Love too. By the way, the entire pre-credit sequence is Grant stalking a man in a James Bond mask, which we don't know he's in a mask until the very end. But it shows basically James Bond being strangled by Grant and killed until he pulls off the mask. So there's a lot of that kind of imagery in these Connery Bond films, and I don't know if it was just coincidental or if it was intended or what, but it pops up a lot. And that's some decent writing there, actually. Even though Bond doesn't figure out a way out of the casket himself, the fact that he does realize that the money must be fake because they would not burn up 50,000 real dollars. I mean that's that's some decent situational writing. And here's the White House. The first time we get a look at the at this setup, which is obviously based on, well, I say obviously, I'm not sure how many people nowadays really know the whole story of Howard Hughes and his time in Vegas. Excuse me, and what kind of a recluse he was, and the fact that he was a drug addict with terrible OCD and was the first billionaire. But Howard Hughes is a really interesting character. I've read a couple of not a character. I mean, I don't mean by fictional character. I mean he was an interesting person. I've read a couple of biographies on Howard Hughes. By the way, Shady Tree's act here seems awful. The jokes are right out of you know the 1820s. This is just a horrible show. I'd much rather be out in the casino doing anything other than sitting there watching Shady Tree. But anyway, Howard Hughes would lock himself in rooms and buildings for months and months. This is a very general overview of Howard Hughes, and urinate in glass bottles and not cut his fingernails and not cut his hair, and gave many pages of memos to his staff about how to open cabinet doors so as not to create dust or let in any germs. He had a lot of mental problems that were heavily exacerbated by his drug addiction. And he was one of these people that was so wealthy. He had a very small group of people around him that would never even think about telling him no, because they'd be cut out of the loop, so he could get and do anything he wanted. Well, he decided to move into one of the Las Vegas casinos and took up one of their, I don't remember off the top of my head at the beginning if it was an entire floor or just one of the big luxury suites that were reserved for some of the high rollers. There's Lana Wood, but he wouldn't leave. He stayed there for months and months, which was what he usually did. And the casino started trying to kick him out. And instead of agreeing to leave, he just decided to buy the casino so he could stay. And then he did the same for another few casinos around. And Howard Hughes was really the transition. It's not this simple, but there was obviously the early mafia mob days of Vegas. Kind of the next era in Vegas history was, can kind of be summed up in a very general way with the Howard Hughes era. Um, and you can see why they chose Lana Wood for this. I mean, she's obviously great to look at. And her and Connery also have chemistry, and as I mentioned earlier, that was apparently continued when they weren't filming, but you can't blame him for that. And oh, in case I didn't finish what I was saying about Howard Hughes, Willard White, the character that we'll kind of get glimpses of here, is based on Howard Hughes. And I think that's a pretty clever idea. I don't mind his inclusion in this. I'm not sure I would have chosen Jimmy Dean, the actor we'll see later, who's playing Willard White, but I think the idea of including a character based on Howard Hughes actually fits with the film, and if it had been handled a little differently, could have been really great. Lana Wood has more scenes in this than we actually get to see in the finished film. Several of her scenes, like having dinner with Connery, and then a crucial sequence of her going back up to the suite, which we'll discuss later, was cut, and makes the kind of the rest of the film very confusing, and it's evidence of something I mentioned in the intro. The editing um, the editing choices made in this film are just baffling. We certainly don't need the dinner sequence. It's interesting, but but it's we know all we need to know about her character already without showing them eating dinner together. There's also a deleted scene, by the way, with Sammy Davis Jr. Um, Not sure why they cut it. It's very quick and has almost nothing to do with the rest of the movie, but they left in a lot of other things that were unnecessary. I'm not sure why they didn't leave Sammy Davis Jr. in. This is a great line coming up. I'm afraid you've caught me with more than my hands up. I love that. And the mob guy that we mentioned earlier, his line here of "I didn't know there was a pool down there" is a good one too. There's something about Connery's tux here, and you can compare this tux to the way he looks in Goldfinger, in the tux with the white jacket. Although these jackets aren't really white; they're more of a like an ivory type color. But it I don't know if it's just the way the jacket fits him or the fact that Connery's put on weight, but he looks a little bit sloppy to me. Um, the jacket just, and maybe it's more the style of the 70s that's kicking in already in 71. It just not wild about the fit here. Yeah, and Just St. John looks great there. Um, she really makes this scene work with the toes and all that. I'd be interested to know if that was something her and Connery came up with, or the director. Um, Maybe it was written in the script. I don't know. And you can really tell here in a minute that Connery is not in the same shape that he used to be, when you get a glimpse of him here without his shirt on. I mean, he doesn't look horrible, and he's not obese in any way. He's just not the physical specimen he was previously. Although, I mean, he's in much better shape, I'm sure, than most men, especially at that time, were at that age. Ironically, though, in Never Say Never Again, which we haven't really talked about, but when Connery did Never Say Never Again, he's actually in better shape there, and that was 1983, 8 years after this. So he decided to really get in shape for his return to the role in the 80s. Never Say Never Again, I think, is a good film. I like it more than most people do. There are some instances of bad music and some kind of dull sequences, but overall, I think it's a pretty good film, and I think Connery does a great job. I've been to Circus Circus, by the way, which is what we're going to see here. It was years after this. I was not 21 in 1971, but but Circus Circus already looked much different than it does here in this film. I'm a big fan of Vegas, by the way. I love playing blackjack. It's one of my favorite pastimes. I'm not a gambling addict or anything. I managed to keep it under control, but I definitely do enjoy it. Although Vegas now is, uh, I hate to seem like I'm quoting casino and criticizing Vegas in a very lazy kind of standard way these days, but it is very, very corporate to the extent where they've taken some of the fun out of it, and it's a shame, but that really is the way most of the world is going. Things are just so incredibly expensive. Uh, Running any kind of business has become so challenging from a financial standpoint that if you want to have anything of any size and quality, especially when you're talking about something the size of a casino, especially the casinos these days in Vegas, it almost has to be done by a corporation with millions and sometimes billions of dollars behind it. Costs for that sort of thing is not something I think that gets enough attention by people today as far as why things have gotten so expensive and so over corporatized. It's just a necessary part of society, and it doesn't really need to be that way, but that's where we are. But the pendulum always swings back the other way eventually. So so maybe the same thing will happen when it comes to Las Vegas casinos. Here we see Felix Leiter becoming little more than a keystone cop. I don't know why they felt the need to do that to the character. He's never been the equal to Bond that he is in the Ian Fleming novels. In the Fleming novels, Felix Leiter is a tough Texan that is as important to the CIA as Bond is to the Secret Service. Not that every Felix Leiter in the films has been bad. Some of them have been really strong, but he's never been the same type of character, especially in these early films, that he is in the Fleming books. Him and Bond enjoy in the novels going to nice restaurants together and enjoying liquor and food, and there's some really enjoyable parts of the novels that has to do with their friendship and their eating and drinking habits and how much they go on about them. It's really entertaining, and you never see that in the films. Really, the closest relationship between Bond and Leiter that we see that's similar to the books is Daniel Craig and Jeffrey Wright in the Craig films. That's about as close as we come to the Bond Leiter relationship that we see in the books. And of course, Leiter in the books for for those that take place after Live and Let Die, he has a hook for a hand because of what happens to him in Live and Let Die, which is interesting. Now, see, they leave that thing in with the elephant, which I guess is supposed to be funny in some way. Why leave that in, but not the Sammy Davis Jr. sequence, which really I think is a little more entertaining if you're going to have meaningless little, not even scenes almost, but really meaningless little clips like that. I'd rather see Sammy Davis Jr. in Las Vegas because that's where he kind of should be than an elephant at a slot machine. I'm going to go off on a tangent here. I know, haha, nothing new. But I'm not sure if everyone listening to this has seen the Patterson Gimlin film, as it's called, of Bigfoot, which I apologize if there's anyone out there that thinks Bigfoot is real or there's any such thing, but there's not. And I could go into a lot of reasons why not. But there's actually a man, and I can't remember his name, but if you see it on YouTube, you'll I mean, if you look it up on YouTube, you'll find it without too much effort. That remembers speaking with Roger Patterson, the main guy kind of responsible for the Bigfoot film, over the phone, and Patterson wanting to buy one of his gorilla costumes. At that time, the guy I'm talking about sent around catalogs to different places advertising gorilla costumes, and this is long before the internet, and there were not a lot of those types of companies around that sold things like that, obviously, because there's not a lot of places that need them. But I've seen the costume manufacturer talking that spoke with Patterson, and he has said that one of the things that they used the gorilla suit that he sold to Patterson, one of the things they used that for was an old trick where a person turns into a gorilla that you used to see at carnivals and different things like that back in the day. And I've always wondered, with that sequence where the woman turns into a gorilla, if that is one of the excuse me, not Roger Patterson, but if that's one of the outfits that was sold to Roger Patterson that he then modified to look like Bigfoot. And I've never heard anybody else discuss that possibility, but it seems like it's definitely a possibility because there just weren't that many people around back then that sold gorilla costumes. But I guess we'll never know. Of course, I think the costume maker is still alive. I guess somebody could ask him if he sold things like that to casinos, because I think that was a real exhibit at Circus Circus. Here we see Tiffany coming home and then Plenty O'Toole in the pool. Now, this makes no sense at all. And I remember when I first saw this film back on VHS. I was not born when Diamonds Are Forever came out, so I didn't see this on television. I didn't see it until VCRs became common in the 80s. But I had no idea why Plenty O'Toole would have been at Tiffany's house and why she was in the pool. I thought I must have missed some connection that her and Tiffany had with diamond smuggling or something. I just could not figure it out. It wasn't until I bought one of the books about the Bond films that I realized there were deleted scenes where, after Plenty has been thrown out the window, she goes back up to the suite where Bond is staying with, and he's in bed with Tiffany at that point. She sneaks in and pulls out um, Tiffany Case's ID out of her purse and sees her address and goes there to Tiffany's house later to confront her. Now, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense that she would go to that trouble after she's been thrown out of a window almost to her death. I think you'd just say, okay, I'll just go on about my business. But at least it would be an explanation for why she's in Tiffany's swimming pool. I mean, if you're gonna film those scenes and you're gonna have her as one of the sacrificial lambs, you've almost got to show how in the world that happened. But for whatever reason, they decided to cut it, and therefore the entire idea of Plenty in the swimming pool makes absolutely no sense in a movie that is already well on its way to not making any sense at all. They didn't need um, another sort of plot hole like that. And that's Tiffany's comment about Willard White not leaving the penthouse. That's a very direct reference to Howard Hughes for the reasons I mentioned earlier. I'd like to know what's at the site of this little gas station here now. It's probably where one of the huge resorts is sitting these days. Supposedly, Steve Wynn, who was the first Vegas businessman that started building what we now consider the modern sort of Vegas resorts that are just massive, bought the original piece of land he used from Howard Hughes. I don't know if that's true or not, but I've heard that a few times over the years. If he was able to buy it from Hughes, I'm not sure he ever spoke directly. I'm sure he never met Howard Hughes. Howard Hughes did all his business at this point over the phone. If he did the business himself at all, he genuinely used somebody else as his front man and only spoke to that person. But it would be interesting to know the exact sequence of how all that went down. And this stretch of road right here, I'm sure, is just filled with resorts now. It's odd to see that sort of view of Las Vegas without a casino every few feet. And it's also hard to pinpoint exactly when this film starts to really go downhill. I don't, there's some movies you can pick out where there's a specific moment where the tone shifts, not necessarily in a bad direction, but just, in a different direction. And I don't know that this film has an exact moment. I think it's one of those things where it's just little by little the tone keeps the tone of comedy just kind of seeps in almost like a water leak until by the time we get to the moon buggy chase here that's coming up, one other thing that makes no sense at all. I think I think the dam has kind of burst and we're flooded with just a bunch of one nonsensical scene after another. I mentioned Steve Wynn, by the way. He's a very interesting person as well. Just a great businessman. Haven't seen anything about him for a while. He had a scandal or two 10 years ago or so, and lost his place on the board of some of the casino giants. And I like this little move here where he kind of hides Bond kind of hides what he's doing with his car. And Steve Wynn was also having a lot of trouble with his vision. He's been losing eyesight for decades, and I'd be interested to know kind of where that stands now. This guy does a good job with his little part. I don't know anything about radiation or radiation shields, but and I don't know that a little card basically that you can attach to your suit jacket is would actually function as a radiation shield of some kind. Maybe it does work. I don't know, but it doesn't seem logical to me at all. And this is actually a pretty good little sequence with Bond just continuing to annoy Metz here. Professor Doctor Metz. He's so annoyed. You irritating man. I need to remember that so I can have that ready to use in case it ever comes up, where I can just call someone an irritating man. And obviously that's the satellite with the diamonds that they're constructing there. It looks awfully flimsy. I'm not sure I would trust that thing in space to fire down and blow up a bunch of stuff. And they're awfully casual about leaving their cassette tape that apparently runs the whole thing laying around. This, yeah, it's obviously totally ridiculous that a cassette tape could make this satellite of diamonds, even if you could believe there was such a thing as that. If you that a cassette tape can make the thing work, but back then it was not as ridiculous as it seems now, because I remember having my first Commodore computer where there were a few programs. I think they were games where you not only had to insert a floppy disk, but it also had to have a cassette tape to make it work. That just seems completely bizarre now, but at least the cassette tape thing in context makes a little more sense. I don't know what exactly they're supposedly doing here. I don't. People have said that maybe this is a joke trying to give people the impression that the moon landing was fake and this is where they filmed it, or if you're supposed to think they're practicing for a moon landing. I don't know what sort of great practice you could get wandering around a small set like that for the moon, because they're clearly not replicating the zero gravity of the moon on that set. So I don't know what point they're trying to make there is, unless it's just the only thing they could think of to get Bond into a moon buggy. And this chase here is 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 just really bad. There's no other way to say it. It lacks any sort of tension or drama. It's clearly only done with the intention of showing Bond in some humorous desert chase. How fast could that thing really go? And why is that car spinning around in a circle? There's no reason for it to be doing that. And yeah, the cars would have a hard time on that rocky desert surface, which I guess is similar to the surface of the moon, except for the fact that we have gravity on Earth and the moon doesn't. But it doesn't mean they wouldn't be able to catch that moon buggy. And the moon buggy doesn't have any ability to go over all those hills or whatever. It's so low to the ground, it would get stuck instantly. These motorcycles, these three wheelers here, would catch up to it very quickly. Although I don't know what they intend to do once they get to it. I don't recall. I guess I'll find out here in a minute if it shows that they have any kind of guns or something, but I don't know what the plan is once they catch it. That way, they're real helpful. Although it is convenient that for some reason that laboratory has these three-wheel vehicles with people just standing by that can jump on them at a moment's notice and take off. Yeah, they're security people, so I guess you can assume that they have guns, but I don't know if that's their plan, to catch up with it and then shoot the guy inside or what. I mean, they're just security people. And this guy conveniently takes a long time to actually take off on his bike just for Connery to run up. Although Connery does that himself, which is pretty impressive. They could have easily had a stuntman do all that right there. I'm sure Roger Moore would not have done that. And I'm not one of the Bond fans that just can't stand Roger Moore. Most of his movies are not on my list of favorites, but I think Roger Moore does a good job as Bond, and I'm not sure there are a lot of actors that could have bridged that gap of what kind of movies were popular in the 70s, and kept Bond going. That was a time in cinema where, and this is where Lazenby and his people got the idea that the Bond thing was gone. I think one of the only ways for it to have survived that period of film was to have some Bond films that were almost, well, not almost, that were in many instances parodies of James Bond movies themselves. But I just don't know that there's a lot of actors that could have pulled that off with any sort of credibility. So I admire Roger Moore for doing it, and for pulling it off. And he never tried to pretend that the Bond movies were Shakespeare, and he never gave the impression to anyone that he wanted to do Shakespeare. So good for him. He's not my favorite, but I admire what he did for the Bond role. And here's another chase that is totally devoid of anything interesting, and of course has this huge goof, which we'll talk about here in a second. And this is just lazy stunt work, I guess, and lazy directing on the part of Guy Hamilton, the goof I'm talking about. While seeing the old Vegas downtown, how it looked back then is funny, and this is the days before the mega resort, so that's the heart of Vegas where he is right now, or it was back then. You can see the people lined up on the side watching him film the movie. Car chases had come a long way in film, and God, there's a whole line of people at the Golden Nugget watching them film the the movie. But you'd had the car chases in movies like Bullet by now, and other things like that had really ramped up what was expected for a really good car chase, and this is not one of them. I think the best car chase in any film, by the way, is The French Connection. I think because of the way that was filmed and it puts you right in the driver's seat. I think that one's pretty tough to beat. Bullet is good. There's several that are really good in the Bond films. This is not one of them. And some modern films have some good car chases. Although so much of it is done with CGI, to me it just takes away from how impressed you can be when so much of it's done with a computer. I'm not a fan of that. And this little parking lot, this is not interesting, not exciting. It could have been if it was filmed more in a way like I just mentioned, like the French Connection chase, where you saw things more of Bond's point of view and the tight quarters that he's in, trying to get out of that parking lot and not having much room to maneuver. But they took a very lazy approach to filming it, where they just set the camera up to view the whole parking lot and watch the cars drive around. I can't think of more any anything that's more dull. And here we go with the goof of the car going up on one side, and then when they filmed the car going out, they somehow forgot which side it was on. So it originally filmed, it came out where the car was leaning on the wrong side. And so they inserted that shot of the camera going from one side to another as if he did it again, which to me makes the whole thing more glaring. I think they would have been better off just leaving it where the car comes out on the wrong side. I don't think on the first viewing, certainly in a theater, that anyone would have noticed that the car changed the side. I think you make a mistake trying to cover it up. And in a movie like this, by this point, a car coming out on the wrong two tires is the least of what the filmmakers are asking you to do as far as your suspension of disbelief. So I I would have just left it as is and just waited to see how long it took for people to figure it out because it's not that glaring. I certainly don't think I would have picked it up the first time I saw this movie. Boy, you could not get away with that little statue next to the door these days. I've never noticed that before, but wow, that is not what anyone would consider politically acceptable. And this is basically just Felix Leiter being cranky and irritated that Bond is not doing things by the book. Okay. And that bed looks like the most uncomfortable thing to sleep on that's ever been invented. I mean, who wants to sleep on top of a plastic fish tank? Assuming it's plastic, it looks like it might be something made out of something even harder than that. But I guess you're supposed to think that Bond and Tiffany aren't doing much sleeping anyway, so maybe it doesn't matter. I do like the sequence of Bond climbing to Willard White's penthouse, of course, as we're about to find out. Willard White isn't up there. It's one of Blofeld's doubles and Blofeld himself, and there's a pretty good confrontation coming up. John Gavin, by the way, was an American actor and also an ambassador later during the Reagan administration, but he was almost cast as Bond for this film after Lazenby left the role and refused to do any more. I'm not sure if they tested several actors or maybe tested John Gavin just only him, or if maybe they never tested John Gavin. There's not a lot of information out there about it. But Gavin basically had the role. Gavin's mainly known for his uh, pretty important role in Psycho. And he does a really good job in Psycho and definitely has kind of the Bond look to him. The main issue with John Gavin is that he's an American. Of course, he never actually became James Bond because they convinced Sean Connery to return to the role. And it would have been interesting to see how an American would have handled the part. I'm not in favor of an American getting the James Bond role, but they've come close to giving it to an American a couple of times. They apparently pursued Burt Reynolds more than once, and then before Octopussy, they had basically cast James Brolin as James Bond. You can see his screen tests here on YouTube, and he definitely does a good job. But he obviously is also not British. He's an American. They thought that would work out anyway because he had more of a New England type of accent, and they obviously thought he could pull it off, but that never happened because of Never Say Never Again. They did not want to put a new Bond up against Sean Connery's return to the role, so Roger Moore ended up coming back for Octopussy. I'm not sure I really agree with that, by the way. I There's always so much hype around a new actor becoming Bond and how he does in the role and the new film and what it's like and all that. I kind of think that would have overshadowed Never Say Never Again anyway. And the thought originally was that Never Say Never Again and Octopussy were going to open at almost the same exact time, or at least during the same 2 or 3 week period, but Never Say Never Again had many delays and finally did not open until after Octopussy had already premiered for quite a while and stolen some of its thunder. So, none of that probably would have mattered anyway. Um, Again, I'm not in favor of an American getting the part, but all these possibilities are always interesting to speculate about. and Jimmy Dean, who we haven't seen yet, although we've heard his voice before, and then hearing it here again as Willard White, I guess is mainly known for making breakfast sausage. But I'm as far as casting him as Willard White, which becomes an important role in this Bond film, I think he does fine. And frankly, it kind of fits with the just kind of lunacy of this movie in general. I mean, why not cast somebody like Jimmy Dean in the role? He makes, about as much sense as most other things do here. And here, of course, is Charles Gray again, although, as we're about to learn, that is not Blofeld. This identity switching um, idea was originally brought up when they were going to have to recast for On Her Majesty's Secret Service. When Connery left the role, they weren't sure how to introduce a new actor, and very briefly, there was a plot line considered where Bond would undergo plastic surgery to conceal his identity from the enemy. That idea mercifully didn't go over very well, so they scrapped it pretty quickly. But this is a little bit of a holdover from that type of idea. I do think that's interesting, having Jimmy Dean's voice coming out of Blofeld. Oh, and actually, you know what? Let me back up. The Blofeld right there, that is Blofeld. It's the second Blofeld that comes into the room. That's the fake, the guy on the couch. I got him confused. And this Blofeld having doubles and all that, I guess if there really was a Blofeld and you could pull something like this off, it would make some sense. And I say that. I mean, there have been people that do have doubles. Saddam Hussein had doubles. But I remember hearing rumors. I'm not sure if they were ever true, that Osama bin Laden used doubles. Gaddafi used doubles sometimes. So that that does happen. I don't. They don't. As far as I'm aware, no one goes to the trouble of having extensive plastic surgery to become somebody's double. But I guess the idea is not all that ridiculous. But it doesn't really do much to advance the plot here. I mean, except for kind of the trick of thinking Blofeld is dead after the pre-credit sequence. There's really not much point to this whole scheme of Blofeld's to create doubles of himself. And by the way, even if you could create a double that looked exactly like you wouldn't be able to change the person's vocal cords. So they would still have to fake talking like you, unless the idea here is that the doubles have the same voice implant that Blofeld's using to imitate Willard White, or to impersonate Willard White. Um, they don't ever say that, but maybe that's the explanation. I keep having to remind myself to say Willard White, by the way, instead of Walter White. I just got finished watching Breaking Bad. I'd never seen it before, and I recently finished watching the series, so I keep having to remind myself not to say Walter White. And here you can see Charles Gray is just too civilized for Blofeld. Um, he's probably mainly known, I guess, for being in the Rocky Horror Picture Show and this film. He also has hair. They had gone out of their way to cast someone as Blofeld for You Only Live Twice, which was Donald Pleasance and Telly Savalas, that either that actor was already bald, or they made him bald. So it's odd that they would suddenly reverse that. But I think, as I mentioned before, continuity was not a priority for for certainly the early Bonds. really until the Daniel Craig films. Continuity was not something that the producers or the writers paid much attention to. And this is coming up here with Wynton Kidd back in the story. This is probably one of, if not the most egregious examples of putting Bond in some elaborate situation uh, to finish him off instead of just blowing his brains out when you have the chance. Wynton Kidd didn't go to this much trouble with anyone else they were hired to take care of. So I don't know why they bother with this with Bond, especially given that Bond has already escaped a scenario that they set up for him once before. It seems like they would have learned from their previous experience and the previous experience of everyone else to just finish him off when you get the chance. Certainly, if Bond is famous enough for Tiffany Case to know who he is, his reputation clearly precedes him. So shoot him in the head when you get a chance. But this whole thing of burying him out here in this tunnel, it just is absolutely ridiculous. Or I mean, I guess it's not really a tunnel. It's an underground sewer, I guess. And also, they're taking a big chance. How do they know that the construction crew is not going to notice that there's a body just lying in there? I mean, it's on a lower level than the machines, so it's clearly visible. But but again, if you're going to pick out things like that, I guess you're watching the wrong movie. But it's still worth mentioning just how ludicrous this whole setup is here, and the fact that it stands out as ludicrous in a movie that is known for being ludicrous says a lot. And you could look at this too as another kind of reference to James Bond being dead. Here he's being buried alive, um, encased, at least somewhat encased in something, I guess, kind of similar to a coffin. And I guess you wouldn't normally put a dead person in a tuxedo for their burial, but I'm sure it happens sometimes. And I don't know what Wynton Kid were expecting to happen down here. Did they think the machine that's coming by, and I'm assuming this machine is welding the parts of this project together. I guess they thought that would kill Bond, or if he would just simply die of starvation of some kind down there, or and not try to find a way out. I don't know what in the world they had in mind. And I'm not sure if this, like I said, is a sewer system or if this is part of the waterworks for the desert. That would make sense with the growth of Las Vegas that they'd be having to put in a lot of water piping, but I don't really know exactly what project this is. And that is a very bad line. I mean, there is some clever dialogue in this film, but that is not something I consider clever. The whole walking my rat thing, that's pretty bad. This makes some sense, though, for Bond to use the technology back on Blofeld. Not really wild about Sean Connery's incredibly short tie. He looks like he's more ready for a role in an Laurel and Hardy comedy than James Bond, but I do kind of like this idea of turning the technology back on Blofeld. And of course, this is how he eventually discovers Willard White. And here they make another reference to James Bond being a well-known figure. That just would not work out very well for a secret agent to be not very secret at all. Q gets kind of an expanded role here. Starting now, we see him in the casino later, and obviously see him there with the machine. And it would be really great to have one of those things, a machine that could change your voice and make it sound like whatever you wanted. That would be a lot of fun, and I guess it could also be very dangerous. And why is it necessary for Bond to go up here alone, and everyone else just waits behind? I don't. Obviously, for the plot, Bond has to go up here alone so he can have this again another ridiculous sequence of this fight with Bambi and Thumper, and they start off just pummeling him. It's not even close. They're knocking him around like a rag doll, and then he suddenly wins the fight here just by holding their heads underwater. And I mean, I guess if they're that tough as they're or as tough as they're portrayed at the beginning of this fight, then it makes sense that they could hold Willard White there, but certainly the way this fight eventually works out, they don't appear as if they would be the best bodyguards. And is that what they do? They just lounge around all day in those bathing suits, flying on rocks and things. What? I guess I mentioned earlier, you know, this movie doesn't really have a point where it starts to go downhill, but you could make an argument that the moon buggy chase, although the first part of the film is not exactly wonderful cinema, but definitely I think after the moon buggy chase, it gets more and more ludicrous as the plot, what there is of a plot, kind of rumbles forward. And I say this with all this criticism, this movie was hugely successful and gave the producers confidence that Bond wasn't finished and could survive in the decade of the 70s when movies were getting much grittier and just had a different overall tone. And then, of course, they cast Roger Moore. Live and Let Die, Roger Moore's first film, which I may get around to doing a commentary on, definitely has. See, they're just beating the damn hell out of him this whole time, and then suddenly he just holds their head underwater, and that's it. That was an obvious stuntman for Connery. But Live and Let Die, generally speaking, is a much more serious film than this. Of course, The Man with the Golden Gun, which followed Live and Let Die, has some of the silliest uh, parts of any Bond movie. and I'm not at all a fan of The Man with the Golden Gun. It's a shame, in my opinion, that they wasted Christopher Lee in that film. Christopher Lee, I think, would have made an excellent Blofeld if you, yeah, Leiter's line there about breaststroke lessons are ridiculous. And those men are armed to the teeth. I mean, that guy's standing there with some pretty serious weaponry. Why didn't they let those folks go up there? I don't care how talented and tough Bambi and Thumper might be, but they're not going to do anything against several guys with automatic weapons. But but anyway, they didn't really ask me. And here we go. I don't understand, why is it necessary to find him, Willard White meeting him, and there's Jimmy Dean coming out of the bathroom. There's several bathroom jokes here and bathroom humor, like Connery getting up to Willard White's place and first falling into the bathroom. What is that all about? Is this Family Guy or James Bond? But back to what I was saying about Christopher Lee. If you think about Blofeld's appearance in From Russia with Love and then again in Thunderball, when we don't really see him, there's no indication that he's bald in those films. When we get a glimpse of the back of his head in From Russia with Love, as a matter of fact, it shows him with hair. The guy playing Blofeld in that film was the same guy who played Professor Dent in Doctor No. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. And his dialogue was dubbed by someone else. I can't remember the guy's first name. I think his last name was Pullman, who also dubbed the dialogue in Thunderball. And I believe the same person. And I wish I could remember the actor's name, but I think it was the same person that played Professor Dent was also Blofeld in Thunderball, which is, the best Blofeld, in my opinion, is the Blofeld that you never really see. Because every time they revealed him, he never quite lived up to the suspense, which is tough to do. But they've never really cast a really good Blofeld, in my opinion. Donald Pleasance was not right. He just seemed too whiny. Um, and I'll talk more about the Blofeld casting process in You Only Live Twice when I review and do a commentary for that film. Here, the movie really degenerates even further. That's Blofeld in drag. But anyway, Donald Pleasance, just briefly, was not the original choice, and they had another actor that even showed up to the set and did the role for, I don't know, a week or so before he was replaced at the last minute. Of the Blofelds in the films, I guess Telly Savalas is probably the best in my opinion. But even he's not exactly spot on. Just can't imagine what the producers and writers were thinking there, having Blofeld dressed up like a woman. That is absolutely ridiculous. And if you're going to get all that trouble, why does he still have the cat? Isn't that a dead giveaway? Doesn't Blofeld have someone else that maybe could have carried the cat now and later? I think probably the worst Blofeld is certainly the one in this film, Charles Gray. Although it's hard to blame Gray for it. I don't think anyone gave him the part thinking, "Wow, he's really going to be a tough Blofeld and give Bond a run for his money." He's doing what the part requires as far as the writing for this film. This guy that Willard White is talking to, by the way, is an actor named Shane Rimmer, who I call control room guy because he's often in films sitting in a control room of some sort. He has an appearance in You Only Live Twice, just like Charles Gray, and he's one of the NASA control people with the rocket that gets taken. He's also in Superman 2 in a similar role as the guy in the NASA control room. He is in Batman Begins as the guy that's in the control room for the end of the film when Bond is on the Bond when Batman is on the elevated train. He just seems to always be the control room guy. There might be another example of that I'm forgetting. He has several appearances in the Bond films. He's also in The Spy Who Loved Me, which is one role where he's not control room guy because he's the captain of one of the captured submarines and participates to a large degree in the last big battle aboard Stromberg's vessel. The Spy Who Loved Me is an interesting film just because well, not just because it's interesting for several reasons, but one of the things that makes it intriguing, I think it's definitely Roger Moore's best, but it's also basically just a just a remake of You Only Live Twice, and then of course Moonraker becomes basically a remake of The Spy Who Loved Me. Wow, we're about to see some really bad special effects. It's like they spent all their money on other things in the film and didn't, or maybe on Connery's paycheck, and didn't have anything left over for these sequences because this is really bad. Those people on the left there in the explosion are clearly still images of people. They're not moving, but the worst is kind of yet to come. And why is an American general telling Willard Will telling Willard White? I keep having to, like I said, not call him Walter. Why is an American general telling Willard White about that? And that explosion of that submarine and that above the water looks awful. Um, those special effects look like something out of a Godzilla film. Again, why does someone else going to the bathroom? Why is that a constant theme here? Were they that desperate? And Leiter shown here is basically a bureaucratic grouch. Even if you thought White, this is probably the worst here as far as the special effects. Look at, boy, that's terrible. Um, I'm assuming that's China that just had their missiles destroyed in the background. Boy, that was bad. See, why is Willard White being given all this information? Like I was about to say, even if you thought he was in some position to have this information, like he could be of some help because it's his satellite up there. Given everything people would have known about Willard White at this time, the only thing people it would be clear that he was erratic and not really the most trustworthy person. I can't imagine someone sharing critical information like that in 1971 with Howard Hughes, given everything people knew about Howard Hughes' mental state at the time. A lot of people, by the way, thought that Howard Hughes had actually died several years before he actually passed away, and they thought that was being covered up to keep his massive business empire running. He had this very small group of Mormon advisors that people, for good reason, did not trust. So I wouldn't put something like that past them. But as it ended up, that he was He was alive, not alive and well, but Howard Hughes was alive. Here's Blofeld. That cat certainly seems like it's having a better time than the cat they used in "You Only Live Twice." If you don't know the story behind that, the cat in "You Only Live Twice" really freaked out when the control room in Blofeld's volcano lair started to come apart, and it was the object of, I think, of a lawsuit where the cat's owner and trainer and handler sued because after that the cat wouldn't cooperate because it got so terrified, which I think is a terrible story. I don't like to hear anything about an animal suffering in any way. There's Blofeld being very polite, very mannered and dignified, not at all. Although the character of Blofeld in the novels is very different than the one that we've ever seen on screen. He's Blofeld in the books. He's not really a gangster, but he's just a very successful, very sinister criminal. He's not this global terrorist as we see in most of the films. I mean, his plot certainly take on that element in the novels, but he's presented as a very different kind of character. Maybe glorified gangster is kind of more appropriate. And then You Only Live Twice, the novel, Blofeld basically becomes a recluse. He's in hiding, and he is is an entirely different kind of villain. His appearance changes in the novels as well. Sometimes because of the story, sometimes it just kind of seems a little bit random. But we're getting closer to kind of to the conclusion here of the film. It takes place on the oil rig. This was not the original ending to the movie. The original ending had Bond chasing Blofeld in his little sub, and they ended up in a diamond mine, and that's where Bond and Blofeld were meant to kind of have their final confrontation, but they decided just to end things here on the rig, which I pretty much agree with. That would have been a really long sequence, and this film is already not exactly short. It's it's a long Bond film, although Bond films tend to be longer than average movies, which as a kid that frustrated the heck out of me. I had never seen most of the Bond films until I was able to get them on VHS. I saw Moonraker in the theaters, and I had never seen any of the Sean Connery films. And my father used to tell me, "Oh, Sean Connery, oh, you really love those. They're great." But VCRs were not common, and I the only chance I ever got to see of some of the older Bond films was the ABC Sunday night movie. Two or three times a year, they would show a Bond film on the television, but because Bond films tended to be longer anyway, and then they stuffed them full of commercials, I I had to go to bed. I had to get up for school, the next day, and so I could only watch about the first hour and a half, and that was if my parents let me stay up a little later, just because they knew I was excited to see a Bond film. So the fact that they were as long as they were men, I saw even less of them than I would of a regular movie that was being shown on television. But it also meant I was thrilled when I finally was able to buy or rent a Bond film for the first time once we had a VCR. And if I remember correctly, I was probably in middle school then, and I loved the Sean Connery films. I mean, going from the Roger Moore movies, which again I have a lot of respect for and really enjoyed them as a kid, but then to go back and see the Connery movies and especially the early films that treated the character much more seriously and things seemed to truly have peril and suspense and all the things that Bond is really known for. That was a big deal. And I knew about the Bond films. I'd already read, two or three books about the making of all the films and that. So I knew about them, but I'd never seen them. And here we go with this huge computer, and it's run by this cassette tape, and as crazy as that seems, it's not as ludicrous as it would seem. Cassette tapes and what they used to be used for as far as computers. That's that was a common thing. Now, one cassette tape that size, being able to run a computer the size of the one in a computer with the sophistication it would need for an operation like this, even if that was possible, that you can run that with a cassette tape, but it's still not as far off as it seems. Actually, the computer that's taking up that entire room they just left is probably less powerful than the average smartphone. And that was how did Bond throw those guards off with just a shrug of his shoulders? That's a little ridiculous, but and here's where we really get to Tiffany Case has become exactly what Bond just calls her, a stupid twit. Her character loses all of its interesting toughness that it had at the beginning of the movie. And here we go with the final battle here. And as far as the last big extravaganzas that they like to end the Bond films with, especially during this period, this is a pretty good one. There are obviously some aspects of it that are not that great. What Bond does with Blofeld in the Batho sub, as he calls it, is is very underwhelming, and it's too bad that this is kind of intended, I guess, as his vengeance for Tracy, even though, like I said earlier, they never specifically reference that. It's a very underwhelming end if it is the end for Blofeld, and it was the end for a long time. There's the pre-credit sequence, of course, of For Your Eyes Only, where Blofeld supposedly pops up in a wheelchair, and he's bald again, and you only kind of see him from the back. But Kevin McClory, as he liked to do, interfered with that, and they had to avoid making any direct references to Tracy or Blofeld, even in that sequence. Even though it starts off with Bond at Tracy's grave, but they had to omit any references to a certain number of years since the character in the wheelchair and Bond had seen each other. But obviously he was really intended to be Blofeld, and I liked that. I liked the idea of Blofeld being in a wheelchair with some gadgets attached to it and things like that. It kind of reminds me of Quincy Harker in the Tomb of Dracula Marvel series. If you know what that is, then extra points for you. But I thought that was an interesting idea. And how did she think she was going to change that with all those people milling around in there? Just the change in her character is just so abrupt. It's it's too bad they couldn't keep her as a tough, resourceful criminal. Even there, it's just a complete accident that she gets away. And it's nice to have someone constantly calling out how much time is left in the villain's plot. I wonder how much that guy gets paid for that. I mean, what? Like, why would you need someone like that? But that's pretty impressive. Those helicopters rolling around, that explosion didn't look that great, but an oil rig and a helicopter attack and all that. I mean, that's a pretty good idea. Although it is very similar to the previous film where we had the helicopter attack on Blofeld's headquarters, but you know, it is what it is. Yeah, those explosions kind of need some work. Diamonds Are Forever, the novel, by the way, the ending is one of its weakest points in my opinion, and there's a long train sequence that I won't get into in detail, but it's not exciting at all, and it goes on for far too long. The book involves Las Vegas, which is one of the few things from the book that survives to the film, but it's the main villains are the Spang brothers, and they have what's called the Spangled Mom and the Spangled Mob, and Serafimo Spang, I think, kind of emerges as the main brother. That's the villain, but it's again, it's a pretty weak novel, and the ending with the train, I can totally understand why they threw that out. It's just not exciting and not a Bond worthy sequence, for lack of a better description. And Blofeld's sub here looks especially fragile and ridiculous as I'm filming this. As a matter of fact, we just got the news of what happened to the Titan submersible that had the five people on it that wanted to go down and explore the wreck of the Titanic, and the vessel that they were using. To me, and I guess to a lot of other people, did not look like the kind of vessel you would want to take 2.5 miles below the surface of the ocean. And sure enough, obviously it imploded. But that, again, as I'm taping this, we the that news of that they had found the remains of the Titan submersible, we just got that yesterday. But compared to Blofeld's Batho sub here, that Titan submersible looked like the toughest craft ever created by man. And here's Tiffany just running around with no real purpose. And I know I'm repeating myself, but a very anticlimactic end here for Blofeld, considering that he ordered and participated the murder of Bond's. Well, I guess he didn't order the murder of Bond's wife. He they were shooting at Bond and or shooting at both of them, I guess, and hit Tiffany. But this is not the kind of revenge you would really want to see. And there's Tiffany and just falling off the thing. Man, that's it'd be interesting to go back in time and ask the excuse me, the writers and the producers what they were thinking with some of these ideas. I guess really the Bathos sub ends up being the main thing, despite all the helicopter fire and everything else that causes all these explosions. And then that's the last time we see Blofeld. Um, so we're supposed to assume, or at least at the time, we were supposed to assume that he died in the sub, and as the oil rig is destroyed, just very underwhelming. And here, this is obviously one of those sequences where we're led to believe, oh, everything's over and all is well and good, and then in a pretty nice moment here, we see Wint and Kid on the ship. They did something similar to this a couple of times in the Bond films, specifically with the very next movie, Live and Let Die, where he has the kind of the last battle with Teehee on the train. Notice they knocked on the door, but the door wasn't closed anyway. But here's where the whole little cologne references from earlier in the film come up, and that's a fairly nice touch if you're going to use cologne as a plot instrument. I guess this is the way to do it. That Bond recognizes his scent. But they're not exactly being clever about this. Why telegraph what you're doing by making these jokes to a bomb? And if you didn't catch it, the bomb starts ticking like it's a Bugs Bunny bomb when he first puts the cake top over it and activates it. But but at this point, anything that happens here, uh, as far as ridiculousness, pretty much matches the rest of the movie. So if you're gonna end, you might as well kind of pull out all the stops here. And there you get a little bit better look at Sean Connery's toupee, and like I said before, it's a good one for this film. Not that it's bad in other movies. Now that I say that, it's that was something they typically did a pretty good job on with these movies. And Connery delivers that dialogue in a really good way. And this for a film, what happens here to Mr. Kidd with this fire is pretty intense. They go back to what you would usually expect from the movie with the way Mr. Wint goes out, but that right there is pretty intense with him totally on fire. That's seems like more something you might see in Goldfinger or From Russia with Love or something. But here we get back to kind of the main tone of the movie with what he does with Mister Wint. seeing that he's enjoying that for some reason, and then is nice enough to just wait and pause as Bond does that and throws the obvious dummy overboard is a bit much. I think they pretty much orchestrated that just so Bond could say that little dialogue about tail between his legs. Well, diamonds are forever, but Sean Connery is not forever as James Bond, although he would come back, like I mentioned earlier, for a non-Eon Productions film, Never Say Never Again, that I think is underrated. This is a good song, by the way. Most of the Bond themes from this era, I think, are pretty strong. But that's the conclusion of the film. I hope you've enjoyed my commentary. I'm still learning how to do this, by the way, and I'm experimenting with different ways of introducing things and trying to stop saying and a lot. I know I'm not doing a great job of that sometimes. But if you have any suggestions of maybe how to make these better, I'm always open to some good ideas. And if you have anything you'd like me to review, I'm considering doing some random TV reviews and commentaries. And there it announces Live and Let Die as the next film. Live and Let Die was actually the second book. It's a little strange that they waited so long to do a film version. But also need to get around to doing Raiders of the Lost Ark probably sooner rather than later with the new film coming out that I'll be going to see in a couple of weeks. So, again, if you've got any ideas or suggestions that you'd like me to take on or tackle, please let me know in the comments. Thanks for tuning in, and I will touch base soon.